Good morning. I'm Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. I have the honor and privilege of representing the 8th Congressional District in Brooklyn and Queens. I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee, and along with Congressman David Cicilline and Sherry Bustos, a co-chair of the House Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. We are here today to discuss continuing Russian aggression against the United States of America and the woefully inadequate House Republican response. The House of Representatives is a separate and co-equal branch of government. We don't work for Donald Trump. We work for the American people. Apparently, House Republicans have failed to read the memo, even though it was written by James Madison, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the other framers of our constitutional form of government. We have a constitutional responsibility to protect and defend and to serve as a check and balance against an out-of-control executive branch, and the House of Representatives under Republican leadership has failed to do so. Russia attacked our democracy. Russia undermined the integrity of our election system. Russia launched an unprecedented act of aggression directed at the American people, and yet House Republicans have done nothing. House Republicans are missing in action, apparently because they've been directed by their boss, Donald Trump, to stand down. The House Republican failure to adequately address Russian aggression is a dereliction of duty, an abdication of responsibility, and a shameful act of legislative malpractice. House Republicans are absent without official leave, and it's the American people who have been abandoned. Bob Mueller has a job to do. Congress has a job to do. We should be doing our job. And to discuss the steps that we have failed to take and should be undertaking on behalf of the American people, consistent with our constitutional charge, we've been joined by several distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the Democracy Reform Task Force, and the Election Security Task Force. And it's now my honor to yield to my good friend, co-chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Rhode Island, Congressman David Cicilline.
Thank you, Hakeem. Good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful to be among so many terrific colleagues as we address this very important issue. A few weeks ago, on November 11th, President Trump picked up his smartphone and he tweeted the following: "When will all the haters and fools out there realize that having a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing? I want to solve North Korea, Syria, Ukraine, terrorism, and Russia can help greatly." That's been the president's position since the day he took office, and he continues to demonstrate a lack of understanding of the seriousness of Russian aggression. He's failed to hold Russia accountable for their interference in last year's election. He continues to attack our own intelligence community for concluding that Putin directed the interference rather than expressing strong condemnation of this interference. Instead of presenting the American people with a clear strategy for deterring Russian aggression, President Trump has pursued a policy of appeasement towards Vladimir Putin's brutal regime. The president seems to believe that Russia will change its current trajectory and become an ally. But that's not going to happen. As this report makes clear, Russia has not relented in its hostility toward our country. In fact, they've continued to escalate their dangerous behavior since President Trump took office. Russia is harboring and nurturing cyber criminals who prey on Americans. They're developing new ways to attack our critical infrastructure, including nuclear power plants. And they're still using social media to push fake news and sow public distrust in Western governments. They're actively undermining international law and treaties and attacking American interests wherever they can. And as I've seen as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Russia is undermining the North Korean sanctions regime by shipping in fuel and other vital goods. They're propping up Assad in Syria and Maduro in Venezuela, and they're continuing to arm the Taliban fighters who have killed so many brave American men and women in Afghanistan. Plain and simple, these are not acts of an ally or even a potential partner. These are acts of an adversary. And it doesn't matter who's in the White House, the Putin regime is going to undermine American interests. They're attacking us long before the 2016 election, and they're going to keep at it unless we stop them. But so far, our Republican colleagues have failed to demand that the Trump administration develop a comprehensive strategy towards Russia that punishes their bad behavior, strengthens our own diplomatic efforts around the world, and consistently promotes democratic values. First, they've allowed the president to avoid implementing the sanctions bill that we passed last summer. The administration was required to submit a list of Russian individuals and entities that would be sanctioned by October 1st. They missed the deadline by nearly 4 weeks, and an early look at what they did submit says nothing about actually going after the people responsible for interfering in last year's elections. This is unacceptable. We have to be serious about getting tough on Russia, and that's only going to happen if Republicans start demanding real action from this administration. Second, this administration has weakened our ability to counter Russia with good diplomacy. They've downsized and dismantled significant parts of the State Department. They've closed the office responsible for coordinating sanctions across government agencies. They've slowed the ability of the Global Engagement Center to oppose Russian influence operations. We cannot allow the howling out of the State Department to continue any further. It's setting us back decades. A strong, successful State Department is essential to advancing our interests around the world, and Republicans need to stand with us to demand that the president ensure that the State Department has the resources that it needs to do its job. And finally, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle need to demand that the president stop undermining our credibility around the world. Every time the president praises Putin, or when he says the United States is no better morally than Russia, he's becoming a content creator for the Kremlin's propaganda machine. He's weakening public faith in Western democracies, and he's making it harder and harder for other countries to look to America as an example. And it's not good enough for our Republican colleagues to just roll their eyes. They need to put their country ahead of their party. We have to engage in a collective effort, Republicans and Democrats, to work together to counter Russian aggression here and all around the world that is undermining the national security interests of the United States. And our Republican colleagues so far have been unwilling to participate in any meaningful way in doing this work. And the very future of our democracy is at stake if we fail to do it. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce my senior colleague on the Judiciary Committee and someone who has been involved in protecting our democracy in many different ways for a very long time, the gentlelady from California, Zoe Lofgren.
Thanks very much. You know, last year, 139 million Americans cast their vote in the middle of a massive Russian cyber-enabled operation to influence the outcome of our presidential election. Over the past several months, the Election Security Task Force, which I have been a member of, was assembled in the absence of any leadership from Republicans in Congress, chaired by my colleagues Bob Brady, the ranking member of the House Administration Committee, and Benny Thompson, the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, and we've worked to understand what the threats are to our election infrastructure and how best to address them. Here's what we found. Election security is national security, and our election infrastructure is critical infrastructure. Our election infrastructure is highly vulnerable, and these vulnerable systems are being targeted by one of the world's most sophisticated cyber actors, Russia. These attacks in 2016 were not one-off occurrences. In March of this year, then FBI Director Comey said the Russians will be back. He said they'll be back in 2020, they'll be back in 2018, and their next attack could be even worse. The Election Security Task Force has found that voting machines can be easily hacked. Over 40 states are using equipment purchased more than a decade ago. Many are obsolete or at the end of their useful life, relying on operating systems that no longer receive security updates or support at all. State voter registration databases are also vulnerable to attack. 21 states were targeted by Russian hackers in 2016. If these attacks had been successful, hackers would have been able to alter or delete voter registration records, potentially swaying the results of the election. Now, this is a matter of urgent national security, and Congress should treat it as such. But to date, Republicans on the committees of jurisdiction have failed to hold a single hearing on the threat that Russian election hacking poses to our nation. In addition, Russian appropriators have withheld $400 million that's already authorized by the Help America Vote Act of 2002. That money is needed by the states to replace outdated equipment, implement cybersecurity best practices, and to hire IT staff. The bottom line is this: when a sovereign nation attempts to meddle in our elections like Russia has, it's an attack on our country. Republicans shouldn't look the other way because Russia's actions may have benefited their candidate this time. We shouldn't leave our states to defend against Russia on their own. It's time Republicans in Congress recognize that ensuring security and integrity of our election system should be a bipartisan issue. They need to start putting their country ahead of their party. We have a letter that has been sent to the Appropriations Committee pleading for the funds necessary that have been authorized by HAVA so that we can strengthen the security of our election systems. We have a preliminary findings from our election security task force outlining the security needs of these systems. You know, Russia is an adversary to the United States, but when they attack our democracy directly by threatening our voting systems, there's nothing more serious. I'd now also like to introduce someone I have worked with very closely, Representative Sarbanes of Maryland. He has been our leader in the Democracy Reform Task Force. I've joined him in those efforts, and he is happy to share his thoughts at this moment.
Thanks, Zoe, and thank you for your outstanding leadership on the Election Security Task Force, which is doing great work in bringing attention to the issues that Congressman Lofgren just mentioned. I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to wear a couple of hats real quickly. First, as a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I want to let you know that there's high anxiety among many members there, mostly Democrats, a few Republicans, but we can't get this sense of urgency into the leadership of the committee about the exposure that our energy infrastructure has to attacks from Russia and other foreign interests. And we think that needs to be made an absolute priority. We're urging the committee to put that at the top of their list, that we have to respond to this in a concerted way. We had Secretary Rick Perry come and testify from the Department of Energy, and we've had Neil Chatterjee, who's head of the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They've talked in a kind of generic way about the importance of protecting against cyber attacks on our energy infrastructure, but they haven't really brought forth any kind of a concerted plan. They're not sitting with members of Congress, leadership in Congress, to hammer that out so that we can have some confidence that we're protecting against that. And as it's been mentioned here, the theme is that's an abdication of responsibility on the part of the Republican leadership, both the administration and the Republican leadership here in Congress. We need a plan to respond to these attacks on our energy infrastructure as we move forward. Let me put on a different hat as chair of the Democracy Reform Task Force, where we are ever vigilant about the attacks that are coming against our democracy. And of course, we know, everybody knows at this point in this country that Russia is attacking our democracy. They're looking for every which way they can, and we saw the evidence of it in the last election, to sow discord and division, to pit Americans against each other in ways that can undermine our democracy. particularly at election time. We saw what they did in terms of buying advertisements on Facebook, on these social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google. Very sophisticated. They did a lot of research on how to kind of penetrate these platforms and get to millions of Americans in ways that people didn't understand. We have to fight back against that. We have to do it with a sense of urgency. The Honest Ads Act is one way of doing that. It's a bipartisan bill. It's been introduced. It would require these online platforms to roll up information about foreign interests purchasing ads on those platforms, provide that in a searchable way, an easily accessed archive of what kind of advertising is happening. We think that's critical so that as we get into election time, we can find out who's buying what where, and we can alert the American people, and folks can be ready to respond to that and understand how to navigate the information out there. Unfortunately, we haven't had a hearing on the Honest Ads Act, and this gets back to the Republican leadership, its lack of a sense of urgency to bring attention to these issues. We're encouraging the FEC to pursue a rulemaking that will result in digital ad disclaimers, again, so we know who's buying these ads on these digital platforms. These are all things that we need to press forward with. We need our Republican colleagues, particularly the leadership here, to stand up and make it a priority. So there's got to be urgency. There's got to be hearings. Let me just say this in closing. We can do this. We have what it takes. We have the capacity to build systems to respond to these attacks, whether it's our energy infrastructure or whether it's our democracy infrastructure in terms of how information is shared here during a campaign season. We can do it. We just have to create the urgency around it. We want to see that from the leadership. It's December 6th. I think it's December 6th. In 25 days, we're going to be into election year 2018. The Russians know it. They're already planning for this. We need to plan for it as well. We need to have that sense of urgency. And unfortunately, the Republican leadership is acting like, let's go get a cup of coffee and talk about it. No, we need to run, not walk, to the ramparts of our democracy and figure out how we're going to protect ourselves against these attacks. And everyone who's here today understands that. We hope the Republican leadership will stand up and show that they get the sense of urgency as well. I'm really pleased now to introduce my colleague, Congresswoman Jayapal from Washington. As our colleague, Congressman Cummings, likes to say, some people get to Washington and they hit the ground running, and other people get here and they hit the ground flying. And that's what Congressman Jayapal has done. She's a leader on our Democracy Reform Task Force, and she understands how important this fight is to preserve our democracy.
Thank you so much, John, and to my distinguished colleagues, it's such an honor to serve with a group that is so committed to a just, fair, and secure democracy. For nearly a year, we have watched as the Trump administration has failed to investigate Russia's involvement in our elections. In fact, has actually put forward the idea that perhaps Russia was not involved in our elections. But it is undeniable that, in fact, this meddling has happened. And in January of 2017, the intelligence community, including the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, all released a report on Russian interference in the U.S. election. And they concluded that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign into our election with the goal of undermining public faith in our democratic process. Now, for months we've known also that Russia is actively working to undermine U.S. interests and our global standing, as you heard from Congressman Cicilline. And the cyber espionage campaign is unlike any other threat that we've faced before. Our critical infrastructure is being targeted, including our nuclear power plants, our fiber optic cables, and our telecoms. And a report just released by the Center for American Progress highlights the seriousness of the problems that face us. It is unacceptable that we are doing nothing to prevent this Russian aggression and to ensure that foreign entities are never able to interfere in our democracy. Now, recently, we've had no hearings on this issue, on any of these issues in Judiciary Committee. We did have Attorney General Jeff Sessions come to testify before us in Judiciary. We only each got 5 minutes to question him, but he himself has admitted to Congress that this is a problem, but that nothing has been done so far about this problem. In fact, on October 18th, 2017, before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Ben Sasse asked Sessions if the Department of Justice had taken adequate action to stop interference from Russia or other foreign adversaries. Sessions at that time responded, probably not. Less than a month later, while testifying before our House Judiciary Committee, the issue came up again. Representative Hank Johnson at that time asked whether Sessions ordered a review of laws that may need to be updated to protect our democracy from foreign influence, and he answered. This was his quote, "We have discussed those matters, but no completion has been done. We are not anywhere near where I would like us to be yet." This is from the Attorney General himself. And when I followed up and asked Attorney General Sessions again whether he had ordered a review or taken any steps, he said, "I have not." Frankly, I don't know what the Attorney General is waiting for. I don't know what Chairman Goodlatte is waiting for. I don't know what Speaker Ryan is waiting for. This is a serious threat, and the failure to act against Russia's interference and influence is simply unacceptable. As my colleagues have said, we're about to go into an election year, and time is of the essence. We have a sacred duty to do everything in our power to protect our democracy, and it's been becoming increasingly clear that Congress has to step up and exert its authority. So this is of critical importance to our democracy, and our jurisdiction as a congressional body depends on our actually having a plan and implementing that plan and taking steps. So I urge our leadership in the Republican leadership in the House and all of the chairmen of these committees that we're speaking from to take action around these issues and let us put together a bipartisan plan to ensure that we protect our democracy. Thank you very much. And with that, let me turn it back to Representative Jeffries.
Thank you, Pramila. Any questions on topic first?
For Congressman Sarbanes or whoever, you guys mentioned the lack of a sense of urgency among the Republican leadership. The New York Times had a report last week mentioning President Trump pressuring committee chairmen and leaders to curtail their investigations. Do you think that the Republican leadership in the House is being told by Trump not to investigate and following his orders?
Well, I don't know exactly what the communications are, but unfortunately, the House Republican leadership seems to be, I don't know, adopting the same blindness or blind spot that the president has with respect to dealing with Russia. I mean, I think the president's most egregious in that respect, but the leadership here has a responsibility to stand up, not as Republicans, but as Americans, and figure out how we push back on the attacks we're seeing from Russia across all of these various arenas, let's say. And obviously, if they're responding to the direction of the president to kind of have a soft touch when it comes to these investigations, that would be a problem. We don't necessarily know that to be true. But let's forget about the president for a minute. We're talking about, everybody here has emphasized that Congress has a role. We're an independent branch of government here. And regardless of the position that the president takes in terms of how aggressive or not he's going to be in responding to these concerns about Russian hacking across all of these areas, Congress has an independent responsibility to step up as representatives of the people who are concerned about this. When we talk to our constituents, they're worried about it. They're worried about what's happening in democracy. We have a responsibility to respond to that concern out in the public. That's what we're trying to do. We're just asking the Republican leadership to do the same thing.
For any of you working on the Honest Ads Act, is there any talk about trying to get this in the spending bills, or I know Senator McCain is a sponsor in some must-pass defense legislation next year? What's the plan for advancing
Well, Well, I'm one of the co-sponsors of the Honest Ads Act, and as I said, it's bipartisan. So we hope there may be opportunities in legislation that moves under the Republican leadership here in this Congress to get those rules in place. Whether it moves as part of a package or it moves as a standalone, I think the arguments for it are very strong. And as I say, we have Republican colleagues. But whether it's going to be part of a package or whether it's going to be moving independently, we need to get hearings on it so there can be broader awareness about it, and we can see that there's a commitment on the part of the Republican leadership to make this a priority. So let's do things in that order. Let's get hearings. Let's show that it's a priority, and then let's move from there in terms of how we actually get this enacted into law.
Let me just add, House Republicans have clearly abdicated their constitutional responsibility in the context of Russian aggression. There are only two options. Either House Republicans are being willfully blind to the threat that exists, or they are being punked by the President of the United States of America.
When you bring this up with them, like what kind of responses do you get? They just say no hearings.
Well, I'll let other members respond, but on every single committee, Foreign Affairs, Judiciary, Homeland Security, Energy, and Commerce, just to name a few, there have been consistent requests from the ranking member or the entire body of House Democrats on the committee to uphold our responsibilities to address the threat of Russian aggression, confront the fact that they attacked our democracy, and deal with the fact that it has occurred in the past, it may be occurring right now, and the intention is for Russia to continue to interfere with our elections, and that's why there should be a strong response.
I just want to talk a little bit about election security, because we have authorized funding of $400 million under HAVA. We saw in July at DEF CON, which is the premier hacker conference, 25 election systems that were hacked by people with no prior information. Within 20 minutes, they had compromised those election systems. So we need to act right away. We've got states that are using systems supported by Windows XP and Windows 2000. They don't even have security support. So every American has a right to know that when they go in and they cast their ballot, it will be counted, it will be totaled, and the results will be the product of how Americans voted. We're at risk for either that not happening or for people worrying about it not happening. We are getting crickets from the Appropriations Committee. I think it's an outrage.
And the only thing I would add to that is, we have a limited number of ways to try to force our colleagues to take up these issues, asking for hearings, writing letters, introducing legislation, and getting some Republicans to join us in that effort. But I think, frankly, it would be very helpful if just esteemed members of the press asked the Republicans these questions. These are, this report is a good opportunity to say, based on all of this information about this, the interference in our presidential elections, the interference in our elections broadly, the nefarious behavior around the world, the national security interests of the United States being undermined, why aren't you having hearings? Why aren't you responding to this? And they have to answer your questions. They don't have to answer ours. So I encourage you to do that.
Any final questions?
On two unrelated matters, first, as you, I think we're being told as this began, Congressman Conyers has announced his immediate retirement. Just curious if you have any comments on that. And where are you guys on what may happen with the spending legislation? Republicans still haven't settled on a date, but it looks like it's mostly clean. Is that acceptable to you guys, or should there be certain things attached to that? I'd be curious to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I'll just address the first question, and then members can weigh in as they see fit. The news is obviously just breaking. We've been up here. I haven't had the time or ability to completely process what exactly Congressman Conyers said. If he is returning to Congress, obviously we have to make sure that the ethics investigation is decisive, is swift, is comprehensive, and above all else, treats the women involved in the process with dignity and with respect.
As of today.
He's retiring effective today.
Yes, he's leaving.
Okay.
What does that mean for the body and for his legacy?
Let me say that over his long career, John Conyers did amazing things for our country in the area of civil rights, the area of civil liberties, voting rights, and many other things. So this is a sad end to a long career, but I hope that we will not forget what he has contributed to our country, which is phenomenal. Under the House rules, when there is a vacancy, an election must be held within 30 days, so I presume that will be the case. As to the spending bill, I think that many of us believe there are some things that need to be included. For example, we've got clinics all across the United States that are going to have to start turning children away because S-CHIP has not been funded. That has to be in this bill. I mean, we can't allow those children who have medical needs to be turned away. There are some other issues that need to be addressed. I have confidence that the leadership, Ms. Pelosi, Mr. Hoyer, Mr. Clyburn, will be making that case to the Republicans that there are some things that must happen, including the state of the 800,000 young people who are facing deportation, as well as the medical issues and the like.
Well, I'm still asking, I asked that they all.
Yeah, I wanted to say with respect to the spending bill, we have articulated to the leadership of the House the important priorities that need to get done before the end of the year, that involve our veterans, that involve a serious response to the opioid crisis, that involve S-CHIP, that involve the Dreamers, a whole number of things that need to be done. The Republicans obviously can move forward with a bill to keep the government open without us. They're the majority. They can do what they want. But we've made it very clear the kinds of things that we think are urgently necessary to address as part of this. Having a 2-week extension, not addressing any of those is no way to run a railroad.
Let me just pick up on that and say that the Republicans have a majority. So if they have a majority and they want to pass a bill on their own, they can put forward only their priorities and they can vote for that bill. If they don't have the votes and they need Democratic votes, then they cannot expect that we will vote for a bill that does not include our priorities. And I think some of what you've heard are some of those priorities. I would like to also mention the DREAM Act and the need that we have to address the DREAM Act. This has been something that we were told Congress was going to address through the president taking back DACA. And we cannot afford to allow these 800,000 Dreamers, actually more than that, some of whom weren't able to apply for DACA, haven't yet, but still do qualify. And so we need an answer to those. If they can find the votes for their legislation on their own, then great. But otherwise, they will need to address some of these priorities, make sure we have a clean DREAM Act, make sure we're addressing CHIP, make sure we're addressing some of these other things. I did want to say something about Representative Conyers because I did call for his resignation last week early. And it was very difficult for me. I came here to this body after being a civil rights activist, an immigrant rights activist. None of the work that I've done on immigrant rights issues would be possible without the leadership of Mr. Conyers, Mr. Lewis, many others in the civil rights movement. But I do believe that we as Democrats have the obligation to make sure that we are consistent and maintain our moral authority about issues that are very important to us. So I had called very strongly for Roy Moore to step aside. I believe the president and the sexual harassment allegations against the president are extremely serious. I've said before that he's unfit to be president for a number of reasons, including that. And I think that we lose our moral authority if we also don't call out those we love who have done who have done things that are bad. And I think we have to recognize and be able to hold the dueling possibilities that somebody can be a great man and have done great things for our country and for civil rights, but also have done terrible things that require accountability. So I hope that we can honor John Conyers' legacy, but I also hope that we can be clear about what our standard is for sexual harassment and make it very, very clear to every woman who is out there that you do not have to put up with this. It is not right And most of us as women, I can tell you, know exactly what this has all been about. We've all been through various forms of this, and I think it's essential that if people come to work in this body, that they know that they have a safe environment. And we have to be clear about that, whether it's a Republican, a Democrat, someone we love, or someone we find distasteful.
Last question? Okay, thank you.